start. My name is Raminta Moore, and I am the Arts and Culture Librarian of Portland Public Library. Before we begin all of our events, we like to do a land acknowledgement, so I'm going to do that right now. An acknowledgement is a simple way of showing respect and a step towards correcting the stories and practices that erase Indigenous peoples' history and culture, and toward inviting and honoring the truth. Portland Public Library would like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is occupied and unceded territory of the Wabanaki, the people of the place where the sun first looks our way, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We extend our respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous people and their ancestor whose rich histories and vibrant communities include the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations, and all the Native communities who have lived in Chewabumkig for over 3,000 generations in what is now called New England and the Canadian Maritimes. We thank them for their strength and resilience in protecting this land and aspire to uphold our responsibilities according to their example. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce Libby Copeland. Libby is an award-winning journalist and author who writes from New York about culture and science. As a freelance journalist, she writes for such media outlets as the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic and Smithsonian Magazine. Her book, The Lost Family, How DNA Testing is Upending Who We Are, published by Abrams in 2020, explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of home DNA testing, its implications for how we think about family and ourselves, and its ramifications for American culture broadly. The Wall Street Journal says it's a fascinating account of lives dramatically affected by genetic sleuthing. The New York Times writes, before you spit in that vial, read this book. The Washington Post says The Lost Family reads like an Agatha Christie mystery and wrestles with some of the biggest questions in life. Who are we? What is family? Are we defined by nature, nurture, or both? It was recently named to the Guardian's list of Beck's best books of 2020. Welcome, Libby.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
So how did you come to write Lost Family?
Yeah, so I've been a journalist for over 20 years. I spent my first half of my career at the Washington Post, and then since then I've been freelancing for a lot of outlets. And one of the themes that pops up again and again in the writing that I do is an interest in the forces that shape us and shape how we see the world. And sometimes that's marketing. I'm really interested in kind of how marketing pushes our buttons and shapes what we value. And part of it is technology, how technology changes our social networks, how it changes even our very identities, right? And how we view ourselves. And so a few years ago, I was in conversation with one of my editors at the Post, and we were talking about DNA testing. And I was so intrigued by the fact that, that genealogists have been researching their families for a really long time, but DNA can kind of, break through certain brick walls. It can allow us access to things we don't know and maybe never could know through the paper trail alone. And for a significant minority of people, it changes what they think. It changes what they assume. It changes how they understand their own genetic origins. It makes them realize that their families aren't constituted in the way that they thought. It makes them realize that their parents maybe held something back about the way they came into the world or about their own lives before they were conceived, right? And maybe the long lost half sister that they didn't know they had. It also allows people to reconcile themselves with the truth of America's past in some cases. There are stories that come out in families that again, we might not ever access because through the paper trail alone, but DNA makes that possible, and it pushes a kind of moment of reckoning. And so all those things were kind of interesting to me. I was interested in this idea of the kind of unexpected or unforeseen consequences of a technology that's really marketed as a kind of recreation. And I was interested in, the privacy concerns around that. Just the kind of, this field it expands out into bioethics, philosophy, psychology. There's an enormous kind of potential in this whole idea of home DNA testing in terms of human questions that we've long wrestled with, age-old, essential human questions. So we were talking about all of this in the context of home DNA testing, and we wound up writing this big. I wound up writing this big story for the Washington Post about one really compelling story of a DNA surprise, and the story went viral. And I started getting this flood of reader email from people who had taken a DNA test in the last few years, because technology hasn't been around that long. And so these were people who were writing to say, I took a DNA test 3 years ago. I took a DNA test 3 months ago, and it has completely and radically altered my life. And I didn't see it coming. And I thought, man, this is incredible, right? And I started getting on the phone with people, and I started emailing with them. And as much as there were differences in the details of their stories, the precise nature of this discovery, the extent to which they were welcomed in or not by their newly found biological family, there were certain parallels that were incredibly striking. And the greatest revelation to me was how deeply this hit people on a kind of a fundamental level, that this was a reorientation of their identities in many cases, particularly if they were discovering something about their own genetic origins that they didn't know. And I just thought, wow, right? This is like a moment of grand cultural reckoning that we don't even realize that we are basically stumbling into. And there's going to come a time in the future we're going to look back and we're going to say, wow, that's the moment when everything changed, right? That's the moment when there was this huge, very awkward and painful, but perhaps necessary intergenerational conversation. And all this kind of transparency was kind of brought to bear, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, on a whole lot of American families. And we're not maybe going to realize that we're in it right now. We might realize it later on, but it just seemed to me like it was a moment that needed to be written about and explored. So that's basically how I started thinking about writing this book, and that became The Lost Family.
The story of Alice Collins' playbook frames your book. Without spoiling the story, could you explain why her singular quest provides such a powerful window into home DNA testing?
Yeah, Alice is a kind of remarkable person. And I knew when I was starting to write The Lost Family that I needed a really good story to kind of push you through the book, right? Like, so I'm a fan of thrillers. I'm a fan of like whodunits. Like, I read a lot of Tana French. I read a lot of Agatha Christie. I like good pacing and I like good stories. And I felt like most important, if I'm going to ask people to come along with me on this journey that has history and science and maybe some bioethics in it, like most of all, I want them to not be able to put it down because they feel like there's such a good story at its heart, right? And so I went looking for that kind of story, and I found it in Alice. Alice is remarkable both because of the story itself, it's very unusual, but because also her story, while very unusual, is in some ways universal because the themes that it contains are very relatable. And then it has all these other stories nested inside of it, like a series of Russian nesting dolls. And so I'm going to explain that. But basically, when we first meet Alice, it's 2012, and it's really kind of the dawn of, in some ways, the dawn of autosomal DNA testing. The industry, which I can talk about later, has been around longer than that. But the kind of DNA testing that we're all kind of familiar with, and we're all, that we're talking about here, and that most people are interested in if they're wanting to test, is autosomal DNA. And that is giving you information from your mother and your father. It's the DNA that you inherit from both parents. And so when you are getting your results, you're getting two key pieces of information. You're getting your DNA relatives, so just people who've tested with the same company. They show up as matching you in the database because you and they share overlapping genetic segments. And you're getting your ethnicity estimate, which is a portrait. It's usually like a pie chart. And it purports to be able to tell you where your people came from 500 to 1,000 years ago, although it's not perfect. So, she, at the time, Ancestry had just unveiled their autosomal DNA test, and Alice was a genealogist. She had been researching her family for some time. She's Irish Catholic, comes from Irish Americans on both sides. And so she was, she kind of like wasn't so interested in that ethnicity estimate because she's like, I know I'm Irish, but she's thinking, maybe this will help me. Maybe I'll hook up with some cousins. I'll be able to figure out which county my dad's parents emigrated from when they came over from Ireland, right, in the early 1900s. So she takes a test with Ancestry. Again, it's just out. It's literally just been unveiled. It's in beta testing when she takes it. And she gets the results back, and they're so surprising that she just assumes that Ancestry doesn't know what they're doing yet. Because the ethnicity estimate tells her that she is half Ashkenazi Jewish. And that's Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And they, have a sort of a genetic signature, if you will, that looks different from the genetic signature of somebody whose ancestors come from Ireland. So Alice is kind of confounded by this. She's like, well, I know my family, right? So that can't be. So maybe I'll take a test at 23andMe, which is another big company, and I'll see how they compare, and probably they'll give me the right answer. And 23andMe's results confirm Ancestry's results. And that's when she realizes she has a mystery on her hands. And what she does is she dives into this mystery. The amazing thing about Alice is she's a retiree in her 60s when we meet her in 2012. And she has worked her entire career. She has this incredibly analytical brain and this very scientific approach. And she's worked her entire career in information processing and data management. And I'm mentioning that because that was precisely the skill set that she would need to solve her own mystery. Because what she had at heart was a data problem. She had sort of basically thousands of cousins and hundreds of thousands of overlapping genetic segments. And she set out to figure out how she was related to her Jewish cousins and which particular segment that she shared with one of these thousands of cousins would help her figure out how she'd gotten her story so wrong. So it was an enormous problem. And most of us, I think, would have thrown up our hands. Instead, she went at it day after day, and she made it her full-time job for 2.5 years. It's absolutely confounding. So the reason I say, and she's also like a lovely person to spend time with. So like as a protagonist, just from a writer's point of view, she's just like a great subject, right? She's like funny, she's wry, she's smart, she keeps track of all the details. She was able to recreate a lot for me. So why do I say her story has other stories within it? Because her first assumption, and the first assumption of a lot of people, would be that if their ethnicity estimate is half an unexpected ethnicity, it must mean they're not genetically related to dad. And for most people, that would be the explanation, right? If you were sure that ethnicity estimate was on target, that would be a very possible scenario to look into. And it is one of the most common times of DNA surprise right now, is people discovering that they're not genetically related to dad, either because there's a relationship, right, that mom had, or because they were donor conceived at a time when maybe experts said, and there was a time when experts said, there were lots of experts, they said a lot, and one of the things they said was you shouldn't tell your children that they're donor conceived, for a variety of reasons: psychological, social, emotional, and even legal. So that seems like a possibility, and she investigates it, but she's able to disprove it. She's able to prove that, she's definitely not, she's definitely not the product of what's known in this world as an NPE, which stands for non-paternity event or not parent expected. Sometimes it's called misattributed parentage. There's a lot of terms for it because it's an increasingly common phenomenon. She looks into the possibility as well that she's adopted and never told. And there are people, and I write about this in the book, who are late discovery adoptees who make this discovery through DNA testing. And it's quite shattering to make that discovery, and to realize that you were never told, and particularly if your parents and your birth parents are no longer alive, to kind of answer questions for you, that can be a really tough thing to grapple with. And the last theory that she explores is the possibility that she comes from a community that hid its genetic ancestry, or in this case, its genetic ancestry and its religion, to assimilate, to escape from discrimination. And there are historical examples of Jews doing that, and there are certainly examples of African Americans doing that. And I write about the story in my book of a man named Rosario, who is told by his mother actually grew up his mother grew up in a rural community in Vermont. And she tells him when he grows up that he is Sicilian. And he clings to that identity and actually really embraces his Italianness, so much so that he converts to Catholicism. He learns to sing opera. He proposes to his Italian American girlfriend in Italy right before the millennium. He's like super into this identity. But through genealogy and DNA testing, he discovers that the Sicilian story is a fiction that his mother told him to protect him from the actual truth, which is that she's biracial. And she had grown up with incredible discrimination in the middle of the 20th century in this community in Vermont. And she was bound and determined that her son was not going to experience that. So as I'm telling Alice's story and she's investigating all these theories, I'm telling these other stories, right? Stories like that of Rosario. And for Rosario, it's really it's not just a reckoning of identity or family, it's also historical reckoning with what America did to his family. And it's an opportunity to reclaim that identity. And he's a kind of an amazing guy. And I talked to him over many months and even years as his story unfolded. So Alice's story is a means of telling other people's story, right? Like we tell her story, we move on to others and we come back to her. And ultimately, you know, she was able to solve her case. It was not any of those theories that I just mentioned, which would have been much more likely. It was like a totally insane and impossible theory that turned out to be true. And it went back 100 years. And so one of the great pleasures of writing this book was getting to go back and do this historical research going back a century. So that's Alice. That's the woman that we follow, and she's quite wonderful.
Speaking of African Americans, it can be very difficult for African Americans to do genealogical research because slave records can be very difficult to find, procure, get released, etc. What did your research reveal about the implications of home DNA testing for the African American community, given the history of slavery in America?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, genealogy can be frustrating if you're from a group of people that were, you know, that have been disenfranchised through history, right? So there's a way in which status in society goes hand in hand with how worthy you were considered of being recorded or written about. So, you know, in order to be able to access your ancestors' lives, you need to be able to trace them in the record. They need to have been written about. Maybe ideally in an ideal world, they would have written a diary. They would have needed to be literate in order to do that. So there's all these, you know, written records that are lacking for communities that were not considered important enough, or in fact were brutalized and were owned. And, you know, so if you're looking back through, let's say you're researching your enslaved great grandmother and you're following her through the trail of history, and you're like, let's say you're following her through the federal census, you're going to slam into a brick wall if you try to go back before 1870, because before 1870, people who were enslaved were not named. So she was just a tick mark in a box, and she kind of disappears from history. So then what do you do, right? And then in addition to that, you know, you have families being separated and sold, you know, down into Texas from a more northern southern state. And so you have all this kind of family separation that makes it, there's a lot of reasons. In addition to, those are some of them, but there are many more that make it very difficult to do this kind of research. So DNA, as kind of complicated as it is, and we can talk about, you know, some of the issues having to do with assumptions about ethnicity and race and genetic essentialism that are problematic when we're talking about engaging with DNA testing. But as kind of, as much of an issue as that is, at the same time, you can get information through DNA in you know, and hand in hand with genealogical research that you can't get through the paper trail alone. And so in the book, I tell a few stories. I tell a story of a African-American genealogist, and that genealogist family, has an oral history passed down to them. And the oral history is that one of their ancestors was enslaved and that she had a child by her white enslaver. And they had that story that had been told to them, but they didn't have a means of verifying that story. And through DNA, they were able to verify that story. And not only were they able to verify that story, they were able to connect up with a white cousin who descended from that white man and his wife. A cousin who didn't know, right? Because a lot of white people don't know about what happened in their families. For a lot of African Americans, they can't not know. But for a lot of white families, they just don't know. And, you know, that moment of kind of being able to talk across these extended families and across that very complicated and painful history is a moment that a lot of people are engaging in right now. And I think it's really important. I actually had a op-ed in the New York Times back in March where I wrote about how, again, as complicated as DNA testing is, this is an opportunity potentially for kind of historical reckoning, particularly for Americans who have not thought about their family's own roles and their ancestors' own roles in slavery. I also tell the story of an African-American genealogist who, this is kind of remarkable. He's able to trace his way to precisely where some of his ancestors came from before the transatlantic slave trade, before the passage, before his ancestors were brought over in chains. How does he do that? He does it through a combination of the ethnicity estimate, which is pretty good but not great, particularly for certain populations, including those with African ancestry. They can tend to be undersampled. So you're getting kind of broad ranges like Western Africa. It's not necessarily too granular. But he couples that with finding present day cousins who live in Africa, whose families never left, and they have taken a DNA test and they show up as related to him, very distantly related to him as a DNA cousin. And when he connects with them, he's able to get much more information. And one cousin says to him, a very distant cousin says to him, our people weren't just from this area of this particular present day country. Our people were the Fulani. And it's the first time that he actually knows the community that this one ancestor came from. Knowing that, he's able to then basically just go wild on Google and on research papers, right, and find out all about the Fulani. What were their practices back then? Where did they live? What language did they speak? What food did they eat? Like all this incredible stuff that, again, he would never have had access to if not he had not spit into a vial.
Home DNA testing is a fascinating phenomenon on many levels. But it is oddly both a curiosity or a holiday gift. Amazon has it on sale all the time.
Yep.
And a profoundly revealing, even life-altering catalyst. How is it both?
So I can answer this question by going back a little bit back into time, and I'm going to take you in my time machine back 21 years to the very beginnings of this industry in the US. And it started with a company called Family Tree DNA down in Houston, Texas. So this story gives you a sense of sort of like how it became both of these things, right? And also the unforeseen consequences of technology, right? Like the way that nobody kind of saw coming what was coming. So the guy who founded Family Tree DNA down in Houston, Texas, is a guy named Bennett Greenspan. And the company sent out their first DNA test kits in the spring of 2000. And the way they got started was Bennett Greenspan was a genealogist who had too much time on his hands, and he had recently sold a company. He was like a serial entrepreneur. And he basically realized as he was doing his genealogical research that he had hit a brick wall, and he was in the habit of reading scientific papers in which he saw that scientists were starting to study the Y chromosome and understand how it was passed down through generations. And he thought, if I could get my hands on one of these, Y DNA tests that they're giving in the lab at this university here in Arizona, not too far away from me, I could, in theory, use it to solve my own brick wall. And the brick wall was like a potential cousin in Argentina who shared an unusual surname, and he was trying to figure out if the guy was actually genetically related to him, or they just happened to share, they just happen to have the same surname in their families. So he, being kind of an entrepreneur and a kind of a charming guy on the phone, he actually just called up this scientist on a Sunday at home And he's got the guy on the phone and he said to him, like, my name is Bennett Greenspan, and I'm just wondering if I can buy one of those DNA test kits that you use in the lab. And the scientist was like, no, that's not a thing. We don't sell them. Like, no. And then he made some kind of offhand remark, along the lines of that he had this request before. There were crazy genealogists who had called him before with this question. And he said, somebody ought to start a business. And
just not me.
Right. Right. And it was Greenspan who had the kind of like light bulb moment. Like, he didn't need a lot of, urging to figure out that this was a business opportunity. He was like, okay. And he started Family Tree DNA. And, in the beginning, it was such a niche product because it was Y-DNA and then mitochondrial DNA. These are kinds of DNA tests that give you access to information about your ancient ancestors and their migration paths really far back in time. And it's along one single branch of your family. So it is not really generally that helpful, although in a few cases it can be, but for the most part, it's not really so practically helpful in terms of doing your more recent genealogy, with some exceptions, right? So it was a niche product. It was kind of not that informative. It was extremely expensive. It was hundreds of dollars. And Greenspan imagined that it would remain a niche product in the beginning. That's what he thought. He would go to genealogical conferences and he would be like unable to persuade fellow genealogists to buy his product. And what changed is that about 10 years ago, Autosomal DNA came on the scene. And that breakthrough of being able to identify DNA cousins, which was something that 23andMe unveiled, and then those ethnicity estimates, which actually probably drove the train more than anything else. That really allowed the industry to take off, and a lot more companies started flocking to this space. About 2016, 2017, you see Ancestry putting $100 million into advertising each year. So just in those 2 years, and if you could watch the slope of sales, like on a graph, like on a chart, you'd see it like going like this, 2016, 2017, 2018. And the ads that Ancestry is airing are really all around the ethnicity estimate and this idea of discovery and this idea of the rootless American who doesn't know who their grandparents are. And wow, you're going to get access to not just an understanding about your past, but a new kind of identity, because you're going to find out that you're actually 15% Italian. And there's a great ad where there's a celebrity who's like walking through a bakery and she's saying like, I just found out I'm blankety blank percent Italian. And she's like ordering biscotti like in Italian from the bakery. And it's like this idea, I mean, first of all, baked goods, yes, but also like, it's this idea that like, there's something intrinsically about you, there's something hidden inside of you that is essentially Italian, right? And it only needs this test to kind of like, make itself known. And of course, that's kind of a complicated and not entirely true idea because ethnicity and identity are shaped very much by experience rather than something essential in the genes. And sometimes these ads veer into what's known as genetic essentialism, this kind of idea that there's something about your genes that is basically very much this or that, and that can be problematic. But what happens is that casual consumers really start flocking to these tests. They don't even necessarily always know that they're going to get their DNA relatives. They're just looking for that pie chart. And then they take the test and they get their results. And for a significant, again, a subset of people, not most, but a minority of them, there's something really surprising in those results, right? They're discovering, again, that they have like a half brother they didn't know about. And then they have to go back to their parents and be like, what's this, right? Or they're discovering, they took a test with dad and dad's not genetically related to them and dad doesn't even know. And then it's like, what then? The burden of trying to figure out what to do with that information, how to navigate it, how to pass the information or not through a family, how to reach out to genetic kin or not, and how they'll react is that's everything that happens after. And that's a great deal of my research was around that, that sort of the 360 of how it looks within a family and then the what then, because there's a lot of Americans moving through this process now of what then, and it's not clear to me that process ever really ends. It's a really big deal with kind of profound shockwaves that may continue for decades.
You had mentioned NPEs, or non-paternity events, or not parent expected. Obviously fascinating. How common is that type of occurrence?
So a conservative estimate is that it's many hundreds of thousands out of the close to 40 million people who have tested. So just under 2% is like a conservative estimate. It's close to a million just because there's so many people who have tested. Um, if you kind of put that together with the number of people who've discovered that they have a previously unknown half sibling, which is the other big category of discovery based on not just my interviews, but my interviews with genetic genealogists and search angels, you're talking about well over a million people. And then if you put in late discovery adoptees, people like Rosario discovering something really important or germane about the roots that they weren't told, people discovering maybe a previously unknown first cousin, because an aunt and uncle had a child and placed that child for adoption, and that was a family secret that was not conveyed, for understandable reasons within a past cultural context. I mean, it's almost a definitional problem, but if you're looking at significant revelations about one's genetic origins or one's family, it's very, very many people, well over a million, but it's hard for me to say exactly how many. But that's not the size of the impact, because if I discover that I'm the product of misattributed parentage or non-paternity event, right, and I'm discovering I'm not genetically related to dad, that doesn't just affect me, that affects the man I call dad. And it affects my mom, because I'm probably going to her and being like, hey mom, what's going on? And then there's some conversations between mom and dad. And it affects my siblings, right? And I'm discovering now that they are genetically speaking my half siblings. And then there's some stranger who contributed half my genetic material. And he lives, I don't know, on the other side of the country or like on the other side of town, right? And I may want to learn more about him. I may want to reach out to him. A lot of people that I've interviewed do wind up reaching out to their genetic fathers. So then that has an impact on him and his relationship with his spouse, if he has one, and his children, who I'm now discovering are my half siblings. And I may want to get to know them and make up for lost time. So each implication, each revelation has implications for easily 8 to 10 people, if you're just looking at the 2 nuclear families who are impacted. So you're talking about millions of Americans who are impacted. The vast majority of them have actually never themselves taken a DNA test.
So how do you find that people respond to them, both the seeker who pursued the information and the family members who did not? I mean, that's massive. I mean, I know that there are even Facebook groups having dedicated themselves to this.
Yeah. Yeah, it really depends. How you react to this really depends on a lot of factors. It depends on, what is the secret to you? So your relationship to the secret, or the thing that was kept from you, right? Your relationship to that, the nature of what was kept, how much power you had during the process of discovery, or how much not power, in other words, the extent to which you're autonomous and you have agency during the searching process seems to impact people for the better. And your place in the kind of triad. So whether you're the person making discovery about your own genetic origins, or the nuclear family that you grew up in, or the family that you're actually discovering you're genetically related to, right? So depending on your place within that, it really can vary your relationship to the truth. Also, whether this upends sacred narratives about your family or sacred narratives about people that you love can make it more or less threatening to accept this. So there are people, so just to kind of give you like broad brush, although it's like really varies a lot, but the vast majority of people that I interviewed who discovered through testing something important about their own genetic origins, they described it often as really painful, sometimes as a trauma, but they said ultimately they were glad to know. Now that was true even in really extreme circumstances. Like there was a woman that I interviewed who discovered that her genetic father was her mother's first cousin, And when she spoke with her mother about it, her mother said actually it was coerced, it was a rape. So for her, you would expect in that situation that knowledge to be, and it was incredibly painful, but even she said to me, I'm so glad I know the truth. Now, why are these people so glad they know the truth? Because it's the truth, right? It's about your own identity. And it informs your understanding of the world. It explains things. It explains sometimes a feeling of otherness or a history of family trauma. It puts old memories into context. It just forever alters how you see, your place on this earth. And that's, I think, why people say they wouldn't unknow this even if they could. But how does then that mother fare, right? It's not always true that everyone is saying, I'm glad I'm glad that everyone knows the truth, right? The people who had the knowledge and didn't reveal it for a very long time because it was rooted in a stigma or a shame or a violence or what have you, something that was considered taboo, like using a sperm donor in the 50s maybe, right? Something you were advised not to talk about. They're not always in a position where they're happy that this is revealed. And I have not seen a lot of research yet on kind of the long-term effects. Like, is this something where eventually with mental health support, you could be better off that you're finally speaking the truth? Maybe, but we're just not kind of far along enough in knowing that. And then the family that's on the other side of this, like the newly discovered family, they can react very, very differently. So some are like genetic fathers. I tell stories in the book, they're open armed. And some are like, you're calling me and you're getting me in trouble with my wife, like stop calling. There's a guy who sends his genetic daughter a letter through his attorney saying, stop contacting me. There's a guy who deletes his kit. There's a couple of sisters who say to their genetic half-sister who finds them through testing, she says to them, I'm your long-lost half-sister. I was a foundling. Your mother, our mother, had me and placed me on a doorstep at 4 days old, 1962, on a pastor's doorstep, right? And I was adopted and I've been searching and I'm like thrilled to be able to find you all these years later. And they say, our mother wouldn't do that. And that's where you see this kind of, the threat to sacred narratives, right? Like, it's such a difficult position for so many people to certainly, have all this information and there's no real guide or no one holding your hand or kind of helping you through, and your mom's not alive and you can't ask her questions to contextualize it, right? And so you really see quite a wide range of reactions to these surprise outcomes.
So, along those lines, what happens when family histories and family narratives collide?
Yeah, I mean, that's what happens is people saying our mother wouldn't do that, right? What happens is people saying, you're suggesting that my dad cheated on my mom, and like, basically, how dare you? Sometimes the person who's coming in, the person who had no control over the fact that their circumstances of their birth was made secret, they then find themselves reaching out to biological kin. Maybe they've only recently discovered the truth about their own genetic origins, and they're made the messengers of their own existence. In other words, the family on the other side doesn't even know that they exist, right? They don't even know that dad had a relationship in 1975 and that this child was born, right? And there's that saying, like, don't shoot the messenger, right? We say that because we mean don't take it out on the person who's just bringing you the news. It's not their fault, right? Well, when you are made the messenger of your own existence, what often happens is that you are seen as a threat and you're kind of like told to go away. And that's incredibly painful for people. I refer to people in the book who are seeking knowledge of themselves through understanding of the past and DNA testing as seekers. So that can be incredibly painful for seekers.
So we're now at the tipping point that you spoke of earlier, and we've seen some dramatic implications for solving cold case murders. And most recently, we were talking before this, there was a rape case in Tampa, Florida, that was solved. But the big one in the news was the Golden State Killer. Is is it fair for DNA test results that were obtained to illuminate family history to be used to solve this crime? I mean, there are a lot of privacy implications on
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. So first, the tipping point is basically this acknowledgement of the fact that the vast majority of Americans are potentially impacted by this technology, even though they haven't tested, and that people are identifiable even if they're not in the databases. So even if you've never spit into a vial, you're potentially identifiable to somebody who's looking for you and genetically related to you because you have enough other cousins who've tested. And people are identifiable from a third cousin or closer match, potentially, not in every situation, but often. And so that means that if you're a guy, like let's say you're that guy who had a child in 1975, maybe you don't even know it, maybe you were in high school, it's not as if you need to ever spit into a vial in order for that genetic child to be able to identify you and reach out to you, right? So that means that we need to be thinking about these questions because we're all potentially impacted. You can't just put your head in the sand and say, well, I'm not going to do that, because you could still discover something germane to your identity, your family, your health, because of a test that somebody related to you takes. And I also think that the phenomena is very important because all these questions of nature versus nurture and identity and ethnicity and family and what is family, right? Like they're all kind of thrown into quite dramatic relief by the outcomes of these tests. So the fact that you can identify somebody who's not in the database has meant that now law enforcement has an incredibly powerful tool. And that incredibly powerful tool, the turning point for that was 3 years ago in 2018 when the Golden State Killer case was solved. The techniques that were used were not new. In fact, people who are adopted have been using those same techniques through DNA databases to find their birth parents for several years before that. By now about a decade. But the key difference was that this was the first time this was used to identify a criminal and arrest him. And since then there have been hundreds of cases solved in this way. And there are a number of issues. I mean, one of the issues is should law enforcement have this much power? Should they have access to a database that people entered their information into because they want to do family history research? And what is the regulation around this? Can they use this for a really small crime, right? Like if it ever became cheap enough and easy enough, could they do that? Is that okay with us? Because there's no regulation at the moment over how this is used. Law enforcement has a DNA database, a series of kind of a network of databases. But the kind of DNA information that's gathered and analyzed there is much less informative, in part because they were trying to protect and preserve privacy. So you can't do what's called long-range familial searching very well in the CODIS, which is the colloquial term for the law enforcement databases. But you can certainly do it with the kind of rich and informative DNA that's gathered for family history purposes. It's designed to help us understand all this stuff about ourselves, right? It's designed to kind of analyze really informative spots along the genome. And for that reason, it is a privacy concern. And so there's a real, it's important to know, by the way, that different companies treat this question differently. So the two big ones, Ancestry and 23andMe, it's very hard to gain access to their databases, and that's part of it. Yeah, there's different levels of being able to gain access to different databases, and they are the most kind of locked tight. And they've said that if law enforcement comes to them, they would need a subpoena or a warrant in order to get information of this kind, to investigate a crime, and that they will, 23andMe in particular says, we'll fight it. That's different than Family Tree DNA. Family Tree DNA, which again is the oldest company I was talking about earlier, they were actually cooperating with the FBI for months before they even told their consumers, in apparent violation of their own consent document. So people didn't even know. And now they do, presumably most people know. I don't know how many of their consumers know, but you have to actively opt out in order to say my information isn't going to be used that way. And there's some people who just kind of left the company because they were like, on the other hand, the polling that I've seen among Americans, they're not up in arms about this. There's a strain of civil libertarians and privacy advocates who talk about this, and they're worried about this. But the polling that I've seen, and it was done right after the Golden State Killer case, because law enforcement has primarily used this to catch like age-old serial killer, like old murders and sexual assaults, right? The kind of the worst of the worst. People are kind of, American opinion tends to be like, that sounds good to me. Don't use it on these other things, but it's fine to use it on this. But then what is the body that is regulating that to make sure that that is the only way it's used? And that really doesn't exist yet. There's like federal guidance for some cases, but and individual jurisdictions kind of come up with their own policies, but we don't have, it's not regulated by law yet. So it's kind of wild.
But along those lines, I think, or at least I am personally scared for, if someone in my family uploaded their DNA or I uploaded my DNA, where's the, you're saying there's not a lot of regulation. Where's the stop to keep them from selling my information in the future? I could be typecasted by my insurance company and not given coverage because my DNA says that I have a pre-existing condition.
Right.
When does that end user agreement actually help us? Nobody reads those.
Right. And I was telling you before we started, like I read them for the book, right? And the 23andMe document was 10,000 words long, and I read it and I was like, why didn't I get my law degree? Because I don't understand this. Yeah, I'm going to answer your question. I'm popping into the chat just because I don't want to forget that that you can get signed copies of my book from a bookstore in New York if people are interested, because this is kind of like I guess it's kind of like a book talk, but I can't.
Oh, for sure. Yes, absolutely.
So I'm popping on it. I also have a newsletter that I send out very infrequently that I should send out more often. But anyway, if people want to sign up for that, that doesn't get sold. So there you go. But yeah, so the problem with answering your question is we don't know what we don't know yet, right? The questions that you're asking are extremely astute, and they're the questions that I asked a lot of lawyers and bioethicists, right? Like, what about insurance discrimination? What if I decide I want to get disability insurance because I take a test and I find out I'm at higher risk of a particular disease, and then I apply to X and Y company and they somehow discover that I took that test through 23andMe, and they say, we're not actually going to give you this insurance, right? And there is some federal protection against genetic discrimination, but it's only for certain, for certain kinds of insurance. It's not for, it doesn't cover long-term care, disability, and life insurance, I believe. So, has that happened yet? I don't know of cases, and I really scoured to try and find them. I don't know of cases where that's actually happened yet, but it's a concern. And I know the insurance company is also concerned about the asymmetry of people knowing their risk and just the potentially future ill ones getting insurance. So it's a problem. It's a problem as far as they're concerned too, right? That's a potential issue. Another potential issue could be that, at some point there could be a hack or a breach. There haven't been major hacks that revealed genetic information. There have been ones that revealed, like, I don't know if it's password or, other stuff like that. But as far as genetic information, how informative that would be if it came out, I don't know. I mean, there's a woman that I interviewed who made the argument that she thought her supermarket loyalty card was more informative than her genome. Because how much can you understand, right? It's not actually that predictive, right? You can't actually isolate or identify you from it. Maybe, but maybe you could, right? In future. And so that's kind of the maybe in future situation. You may read that 10,000 word consent policy and you may say, I feel pretty good about it. But what if that company, like you said, gets sold to another company and they change their policies, right? You can delete your kit. Could there be a future scenario in which you can't? I don't know. All of this said, I'm somebody who's tested at 3 companies. And I tested before I was writing a book because I got the kit as a gift from my dad for Hanukkah. And he had already tested, my mom had tested, my brother's now in the system. So we're completely, we're transparent as far as this is going. And we've made remarkable discoveries about basically our family through DNA that we couldn't have made through the paper trail alone. And we've been doing genealogy. Um, and yet I'm, of course, extremely aware, and I kind of monitor this space, and I kind of pay attention to the occasional updates that I get through email from particular companies saying we're changing our policy, and I get kind of nervous sometimes. So I get the yes, and I get the yes and also the concern. And I think, for me, the takeaway, broadly speaking, about DNA testing, whether you're talking about, the privacy of the family, and whether old secrets do and should come to light, or you're talking about, you didn't have a surprise, but you wound up like understanding, I don't know, the life of a grandparent better because you did some DNA and it let you understand that that grandparent was actually adopted, right? Or something like that. The kind of like main theme that I keep thinking about, that I keep hearing over and over, and that I keep meditating on, is the immediacy of the past. The fact that the past, in some ways, isn't over. It kind of lives in us, right? And we're shaped by it, even though sometimes we don't know it. And it's sitting curled inside our cells, and we happen to be in this moment where you can, like, again, because it's on sale on Amazon or whatever, $59, you can crack open your cells and you can make these discoveries, right? And that's kind of astonishing. For my family, that's been really cool. Personally, I think I'm like, this is really neat, right? But I also understand that this is a moment that not everyone wants to have. And in some ways, they don't have a choice about that. And that's really interesting as a journalist to write about.
I have to ask, you're in 3 different databases. Did you ask your extended family if it was okay?
Well, again, by the time I tested, both of my parents were already in there.
Did they think to ask, or no? Of course
No,
not.
I don't think most people do. I don't think most people do. And that is a conundrum, right? Because on the one hand, um, it's my genetic material. On the other hand, I share that with you, right? If you were to really investigate how people felt about it, you would probably have to contact every third cousin, which, I don't know them. I don't know. I do think that there are a few stories I've heard where people have consulted family, but I would say the vast majority of people don't.
I have to ask, I was talking about this program with a colleague earlier, and about the privacy concerns, because again, as a librarian in a public library, my patrons' privacy, my own privacy is at a concern. And my colleague said, why isn't the ACLU looking into this? Because it just seems like it's, like you said, it's so murky.
Mm-hmm.
That I'm kind of scared that there's nobody really watching this.
Yeah. I mean, the question about like the regulation of this space has been an ongoing one. And I think, regulation tends to be many years behind the actual state of the technology. There was talk a few years ago of there being greater regulation on a federal level. I haven't seen any follow up to that, but there are states that are taking the bull by the horns and passing laws to try to protect their citizens. And, so that's kind of like a patchwork. That's not at this point a very big patchwork. It's just a few states.
Do you know
Yeah.
which ones? I mean, I could assume maybe
Yeah.
California.
I think Florida was the most recent.
Wow.
Utah passed a law as well. Maryland has passed a law specifically pertaining to investigative genetic genealogy, which is the name of the investigation of cold crimes through the DNA databases. So it depends. Like, I think some of the laws have to do with genetic discrimination, and some of them have to do with the practice of using these databases to solve crimes. Yeah, and sometimes that's coming from. You said wow when I mentioned Utah. I believe that in some cases, and I may be getting it wrong, I have to look up the status of the law in Utah. I know they were pushing for it, and I think it passed. Sometimes there's an alliance between libertarians and progressives on this issue. So that's what was happening in Utah.
Well, and Utah is strange for me just because and I hope this doesn't come across as insulting. There's a high rate of Mormonism in Utah, and the Mormons are very big on genealogy.
Yeah.
And so I could see a state with a large Mormon population saying, well, but we would like to know more and find more of our family, etc. So that,
yeah, I mean, and it's not cutting back on DNA testing. It's just an attempt, and I hope I have it right that it's Utah. But it's just an attempt to kind of protect people from potential future as yet not have happened. That's not even like language that I can say. It hasn't happened yet, but they're trying to protect people from potential future breaches of privacy or discrimination, right? But you're absolutely right that that the church, the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, has a great interest in understanding genealogy. And one of the things I got to do for the book was go to Utah and go to Salt Lake City and go to the Family History Library, which is the largest genealogical research library in the world. And it was like totally incredible, and my mind was blown, right? It was remarkable. It's like floor after floor. And then I also got to tour Ancestry, which is out in Lehigh. Ancestry's headquarters, which is huge and had just been built. And so I got to get in there and see what that's like.
Genealogist dream.
Yeah, I don't know that there's ever been a journalist inside. It was quite hard to get in. So it was pretty neat to be able to get in there. During the tour, there was one room where they were actively indexing, scanning, digitizing, and indexing records. And they do this all over the world. Ancestry does, and other companies too, because they of course offer subscription access to their genealogical archives. And it was remarkable. It was like, these like rolls of film from old newspapers, the Ottawa Citizen, 1982. It was just like piles and piles and piles of data about to become accessible. It was so incredible. And I was just thinking of all the discoveries and all the potentially secrets that were buried in this data that just needed to be kind of brought up, and sometimes in some cases combined with DNA testing in order for people to be able to like recreate the past. It's remarkable.
This has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Libby.
Thank you so much for having me, and everyone who joined. It was lovely to see you. Thank you. Or not see you. It was lovely to talk at you. Sorry, I couldn't see you. All right.
Thanks again.
Bye. See you later.
Bye.